12 yards. That's the distance between two countries. 12 yards of rock and sea separating one continent from another. On one side, Morocco. On the other, a small city that somehow both Europe and Africa are at once, Ceuta. In the last few days, thousands of people crossed that distance all at once. Swimming, climbing over breakwaters, running along the sand, with no idea what they'd find on the other side. And the strangest part isn't the number of people. It's that this border only becomes easy to cross when it's convenient for someone standing nowhere near that beach. You're about to find out exactly who. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because what's coming is going to change the way you look at the next border crisis that shows up in your feed. Ceuta has a little over 80,000 people living in it. A Spanish territory sitting on the north coast of Africa, separated from Morocco by a line that, on paper, is one of the most heavily guarded borders in Europe. It's been standing there for centuries. A piece of Europe boxed in by Moroccan land, connected to the rest of Spain only by sea, working as a free port and trading post between two worlds. It's the kind of place that fits the story we like to tell ourselves, that Europe and North Africa can share a border that's open enough for trade and locked down enough for safety. That's the postcard version. And here's a detail worth pausing on. Ceuta isn't the only Spanish city stuck in this odd geographic spot. A few hundred miles down the coast sits Melilla, another Spanish city fully surrounded by Moroccan territory, with the exact same kind of land border and the exact same vulnerability. No other country in the European Union has two entire cities boxed in by a single neighbor outside the continent. That leaves Spain alone, doubly exposed to this kind of play. In the last few days, that line simply stopped working. Tens of thousands of people entered the city within hours, many crossing the breakwater between the two countries on foot or by swimming. Whole families, young men, and according to reports, hundreds of children in this wave alone. The city's reception center was built to hold a little over 500 people. It was already running above that before this wave even started. To handle all of it, the city had a little over 500 civil guards, not all of them available, and only a handful of maritime rescue agents covering the entire region. The Spanish government called it a migration crisis. The President of the United States publicly called it an invasion. Spain's own Prime Minister called it an attack on the country's territorial integrity. Shops shutting their doors, a hospital pushed past capacity, a city council voting unanimously to ask the national government to declare a state of emergency. That's the version that traveled around the world in a matter of hours. Chaos, urgency, a small city swallowed overnight. But I promise you, what looks like a spontaneous explosion of human desperation has a structure sitting underneath it. And it's happened before in other countries, in almost the exact same way. If you want to see how borders turn into political bargaining chips in other parts of the world, there's a video right here on the channel about exactly that. First layer, this has happened before, and not just once. In May of 2021, the same script played out in this same city. Thousands of people crossed the border overnight while Moroccan police, on the other side, simply did nothing to stop it. The trigger, at the time, was diplomatic. Days earlier, Spain had quietly agreed to hospitalize the leader of a political movement Morocco considers hostile, tied to the long-running dispute over Western Sahara. Morocco didn't need to declare war. All it had to do was let go of its own border for a few days. The route goes back even further. In 1975, in an episode known as the Green March, Morocco's government organized the movement of hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians toward Western Sahara, which was under Spanish control at the time. This wasn't an army, it was ordinary families, pushed toward the border, counting on the fact that the other side wasn't going to open fire on civilians. It worked. Spain pulled out of the territory weeks later, leaving behind a territorial dispute that's still unresolved today. And this isn't unique to these two countries. In February of 2020, Turkey, in the middle of friction with the European Union, let go of its own border control and sent thousands of people straight toward Greece. Years later, it was Belarus's turn on the border with Poland. In an episode the country's own president admitted, in an interview was, quote, a form of blackmail, end quote. Morocco, Turkey, Belarus. 3 different countries, 3 different moments, the same playbook. Open the border at the right time, for the right audience, whenever political pressure needs a push. It's not a spontaneous reaction, it's not a one-day decision, it's a repeated strategy, tested, and so far, effective enough to keep getting used. It's not a security failure, it's not a scheduling coincidence, it's a signal. In the current case, part of the Spanish press has already pointed out that days before this new wave, the Spanish government had met with Algeria, Morocco's historic rival. There's no official confirmation that one thing caused the other, but the timing follows the same pattern that's been repeating since 1975. There's also a political debate worth mentioning without taking sides. Part of the Spanish government blames a pull factor, domestic policies that unintentionally encourage more people to attempt the crossing. Part of the opposition disagrees and puts most of the blame on weak border reinforcement. Neither side tends to bring up the third factor, the outsourcing model itself, which keeps existing no matter who's in power in Madrid. And there's an institutional piece that rarely makes it into the coverage. Frontex, the European agency responsible for the bloc's external borders, runs on a limited mandate and budget precisely because most of the practical responsibility gets pushed onto bilateral deals between each country and its neighbors. Second layer, the border is also an invoice, and somebody's been paying it for years. Since 2007, Morocco has received more than 13 billion euros in aid from the European Union, a large chunk of it earmarked specifically for migration control. 13 billion euros is more money than the entire annual budget of several countries put together, the kind of sum that could fund on its own decades of a program the size of a major U.S. federal food assistance program. And Morocco is far from the only country in this kind of arrangement. The deal with Turkey, back in 2016, put up to 6 billion euros on the table so the government would hold, inside its own borders, the flow of refugees fleeing the war in Syria. Turkey got its billions in one negotiation. Morocco got its money in smaller successive rounds, always with a portion specifically tagged as funding to stop illegal immigration. This isn't humanitarian aid, it's not generosity between neighbors, it's a contract. A contract where the service being paid for is keeping people on the other side of the line. And when the client is late on a payment or becomes a political headache, the service stops running for a few days, exactly long enough to become a headline around the planet. Here's another detail that rarely gets discussed. A good chunk of that money has limited oversight over where it actually ends up. Audit reports have already flagged how hard it is to track, dollar for dollar, whether every installment landed where it was supposed to. That alone doesn't prove theft. It means the payout model has very little transparency, which makes it that much easier for whoever's receiving the money to use it politically. Third layer, the price of all this doesn't land on whoever designed the deal. The money comes out of the European Union's coffers, meaning out of the pocket of every taxpayer in the bloc. And when the mechanism breaks down, or gets used as leverage on purpose, the fallout lands on whoever's caught in the middle. The 80,000 residents of a small city, shop owners afraid to open up, the handful of agents trying to pull hundreds of people out of the water at once, and the families crossing, many with kids, arriving without food or water at a center that was already packed before they even left home. It's not the neighbor that profits, it's not the migrant that profits, it's the entire system that sustains itself on top of both. Nobody caught in that middle ground designed this strategy. The people who design it negotiate it in an office, thousands of miles from the beach where all of it plays out. If you want a round number to picture it, imagine a mid-sized NFL stadium packed to capacity, and then imagine that many people showing up, all at once, in a city with no infrastructure to absorb even a fraction of that in a matter of days. And on the other side of that same story are families who arrived with no idea where they'd sleep that night, people who crossed a sea chasing a better life and landed straight inside an institutional crisis they didn't create and aren't profiting from either. Hold on to that pattern. It shows back up, with a different country standing in for Morocco and a different city standing in for Ceuta, anytime there's a border valuable enough to become a bargaining chip. Not every expert agrees with using the word invasion to describe this kind of movement. Researchers who study migration point out that the term carries a political weight the humanitarian situation, on its own, already carries plenty of. And this mechanism isn't exclusive to Morocco. It's the model the European Union itself chose to adopt with practically every neighbor along its external borders. Pay whoever's on the outside to hold, at their own border, a flow that Europe would rather not manage at home. On the other side of the world, Australia built a similar system over more than a decade, paying smaller neighboring Pacific nations to hold, in offshore processing centers, people trying to arrive by boat. The model was criticized by international organizations but kept getting used by one government after another, precisely because it solves the political problem without it ever having to show up at home. Is there an alternative? Partly yes, and hardly anyone knows about it. The European Union itself tried to reform its asylum system, creating a mechanism to split responsibility across every country in the bloc instead of leaving each crisis hostage to a single neighbor. It's still new and facing internal resistance, but it proves the current model isn't the only way to handle this. It's just the cheapest option in the short run, and the most comfortable one for whoever doesn't want to explain the decision. So maybe the right question isn't who's invading whom. Maybe the right question is why the security of an entire border depends on the political mood of a single neighboring government, and why that keeps being cheaper, for the people in charge, than actually fixing the problem at its root. Until that answer changes, there will keep being 12 yards of rock that open and close depending on the interests of whoever's sitting at the negotiating table. Not the side of whoever's trying to cross with whatever they can carry on their back. If you want to spot this pattern the next time it shows up, the signs tend to repeat. Recent diplomatic friction between the two countries involved. A government on the side that controls the border, suddenly, with security forces visibly absent. And almost always, a request, spoken or not, for money, political recognition, or diplomatic concession, showing up right after the cameras have already moved on. None of this makes either government innocent, and it doesn't make every person who crossed that border a villain or a disposable pawn either. These are things happening at the same time, in a story that rarely fits into a 30-second headline, and that usually gets oversimplified precisely because the simple version gets more views than the full explanation. If this video changed the way you see this crisis, drop a like, tell me what you think in the comments, and subscribe, because every week we crack open another mechanism nobody shows you at first glance. And the next time you see a border collapse out of nowhere on the news, remember, a border that opens on its own always had somebody holding the key.